Hey, welcome to Reason for Truth. I'm your host, Stevie Garofalo, in studio here live with a great friend of mine, Keith Lowder, Pastor Keith Lowder, pastor of a church here in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm going to let him do his own introduction. But Keith and I have been friends since, I believe, 1999. I moved to Charlotte, southeast North Carolina, and he was working at the YMCA, and we became fast friends, and now between now and then, he's been to seminary, and I've been to seminary, but he's gone on to be a pastor. I'm not a pastor, and so his different insights. And today, we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between Europe, more specifically England and the United States, from a Christian perspective. But Keith, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome, brother. A little bit of history about Keith. Keith, I'll let you just tell him you're pastor and whatnot. But Keith has not only been a pastor here in Charlotte, North Carolina area. He has become he lived in England he was a pastor there as well. And we'll let him talk a little bit about that. How many years have you been a pastor, Keith?
I've started the summer of 2003.
2003. Okay. And then how many years? So that's roughly 20 years. How many years did you spend in England as a pastor?
I spent 5 years.
Wow. That's significant. And you traveled all throughout Europe, which gave you a really good, I think, bird's eye view and really a micro view, I should say, of what we want to talk about today. But I want to address, there you go, my glasses. That's what happens. You forget where they're in your head, you know. That's a sign of age, brother. As a crown of glory. So what else? Anything else we should know about you, Keith, before we get started?
Really just, hey, the Lord's been faithful, and he's moved me in directions that I actually never sought to go in. But yeah, 5 years in the UK, serving in the London area. As you mentioned, I was able to travel. And then after that time, I spent some time in 2017 in the south of India,
wow.
which was an interesting time. It was a total of 5 months in 2017, and prior to that, 9 trips to Africa as
Wow.
well. I just have a heart for missions, and it's exciting to see what the Holy Spirit's doing all around the world.
Man, I tell you, we got a lot of episodes with you coming with you in it. If you're willing to lend us your time, brother, I think we got a lot to talk about. I feel like we're just scratching the surface today, but I want to. That's wonderful. I didn't even know that you had been there as many years as I know you. My first question for you, a little bit of pretext. My conversation with Pastor Keith, or should we call you Pastor Keith or Pastor Lowder?
You just call me Keith if you want.
There you go. Well, all right, we'll go with that. Keith, you said a little bit, we've known each other for many years, but you said in your years that prior to moving to the UK, and really Europe in general, but specifically UK, because I think it's unique to America, that you were basically, you said kind of woefully naive, and I say that in a complimentary way, to the cultural differences that would in fact between America, and the UK or England, the fact that you saw America as a colony of as once was a colony of England, and you both speak English, and so you saw a lot of differences. Now, I would imagine that's a natural. Listen, if you haven't been over there before, I haven't been to England. I've been to Italy and Romania and Hungary. I've not been to England, believe it or not, but I would imagine that's a natural reflex, a natural way of thinking. But you said the differences between the USA and England from a Christian perspective were, in particular, were quite significant. And you said you knew that England, again, was post-Christian, but again, you didn't know the differences would be so vast until you got there. Now, with that in mind, I got 3 questions I want to focus on, and we can bounce around a little bit if there's anything else we want to add to that. I'm open for that, certainly. First question is, to stay on script, is regarding the Christian faith. You mentioned that most people in the U.S., that there is, they believe in God, but disagree in his nature. You're talking about the Christianity in America. So most people believe that there's a God. They disbelieve, or they differ, I should say, in how they view his nature, his character, and purposes. But in the UK, your starting point is, you said, is probably that there is no God. More of an atheistic perspective, and I would like to see as well your perspective on how that plays into Islam. But if there is, You said it's kind of irrelevant. Their faith is irrelevant, or belief in God is irrelevant to the day to day life. So my question to you is, can you speak to that issue of those two different views and the implications that it has for the church, for evangelism, apologetics, and perhaps even culture?
Yeah, sure. Um, yeah, before I actually got there, and that wording is correct. I was very naive in terms of the differences between the United Kingdom and the United States. I just had a very simple way of thinking. It was like, okay, we were once a colony and we both speak English. How different could it really be? That was my starting point. Now, I took a class at Gordon Conwell just before I went over, and there was an Englishman there who was speaking to me about how post Christian it was, but it hadn't like fully sunk into me. So when I got there, I found that there were some very salient, very striking differences, and one of those is the starting point regarding theology. Hey, is there a God or is there not a God? Okay, it's one thing to serve people in the church, but the churches that I inherited, I mean, they gave me three churches to serve because there was that much of a shortage
Oh,
of
wow.
pastors. Okay, I'm telling you, it would have been very difficult for me to get a job in the United Kingdom had I not been a pastor.
You mean coming in as a pastor?
Well, coming in as a pastor is what made it easy because there's such a shortage of pastors. See, whenever they have a job vacancy, this is pre-Brexit, okay?
Yeah, yeah.
I was there from 2011 to 2016, so I was there right when Brexit was voted on, but obviously it took years for that to kind of get sorted out. But basically, you do a job posting in the UK, and then if it's not filled, then you expand that out to the European Union. And then if it's still not filled, then you can offer it out outside of that. And so that just
Wow.
underscores for you the shortage of pastors over there. So I was given three churches, but in my incoming class of foreign pastors, there was one woman who was saddled with 11 churches to serve at one time. I
Wow.
was given three. I thought that was
Wow.
a lot. But when I look
Wow.
at, she's got 11 churches, I thought, you can't be a pastor. All you can be is a church council chair slash communion serving machine. I mean, what else can you do serving
No.
11 churches,
Now
right?
I want to pause there real quickly. I have a good friend of mine who I'm just getting to know, actually becoming good friends with. He's a pastor in Western Europe, and he said, Steve, there is a lack of male leadership in the church in Europe, and which is surprising. So you're seeing more female leadership roles, sometimes in pastoral roles. Is that I've always wanted to know that. I don't want to go too much off on a tangent, but is that part? Does that play into this? Is the female pastoral roles as you're seeing in Europe? Certainly.
Well, I can tell you this before we get back to the theology question you asked, is that when in my circuit we had nine churches and I was one of a three pastor team. I had three, and there were two other women, so I was one of three pastors, and I was the only male. So
Wow.
one woman had three churches, another had three churches, and I had three churches. So, yeah. And even you look at the composition of the congregation, I'd say 75% of the people in attendance are women rather than men.
Wow. Wow. I didn't realize that that was that significant, or those numbers were that there was that much of a chasm. I don't know what those numbers are compared to the United States, but that's a good subject for an episode all its own. I think so.
Yeah, going back to your question though about, okay, so I inherited some churches that were really, really struggling. Okay, really struggling, and there was a need for them to grow numerically. So obviously, I'm thinking I've got to get out into the community. So Steve, what I did is I joined two different gyms. Okay, I went to community events. Every cafe within walking distance or in the community that I lived, it's a very walking culture. So there's a lot of that going on. but every cafe knew my name and my drink order. That's how much I was in the community, looking to build bridges, to build these relationships, to invite people to be a part of the life of the church. And so you have to be sharp in terms of evangelistic opportunities, defending the faith, these sorts of things. And the one of the main differences I would say between that I found quickly between the United States and the United Kingdom is that I believe that in the United States, most people, there are exceptions, their starting point is, hey, we know there is a God, but we're not necessarily in agreement regarding his nature, his character, his purposes. Whereas whenever I was in the UK, I quickly realized, oh no, most people's starting point, I'm saying outside of the church, is I don't think there is a God. And if there is a God, I don't even think he's relevant to my day to day experience. And so that's a very different starting point
Hmm.
when it comes to evangelism.
So I want to go back and answer the $10 million question, the elephant in the room, which is this. Uh, I have to believe that opened a window for Islam to fill a spiritual void in part. Would you say that's true?
I think it's certainly possible. A few years ago, I read a very insightful book. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but the author's name is Christopher Caldwell. And the upshot of the book was about the European Union and Islamic immigration. And so, what he was saying is that when you had a lot of European nations, particularly the United Kingdom, in the 70s, recognized we don't have a real we don't have enough workers, so they started to invite people from their former colonial holdings to come in and fill those positions. It changed the nation very quickly. This
Hmm.
is this is beginning in the 1970s,
Wow.
from what I've read, and I can tell you from having lived over there that you had these communities that just pop up of Muslims that, in the words of one of my former parishioners, is that look, they're not interested in integrating and becoming British. They're forming kind of their own enclaves, and interested in Sharia law and these
Right.
sorts of things. And so, yeah, by opening the door in that immigration, I don't think anybody in the UK expected what they were going to get.
Yeah. Yeah, they didn't look ahead. They certainly didn't look far enough ahead. And surprise, 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 as Gomer Pyle says. Well, I appreciate that. So that's helpful regarding the Christian faith and, the difference, the starting point. That gives us a foundation, I think, to what I want to go to next, which is regarding the role. You touched on a little bit of God and government, but I want to speak more to that. You had mentioned that you discovered that while we in the U.S. are kind of drifting more towards a European style kind of socialist direction, there's still differences. And you said, for example, in the U.S., there's still a great appreciation for negative rights, which is the rights of non-interference. But in the UK, there's a greater emphasis on positive rights, which you said, being that the reflexive opinion that the government should function as a panacea. So, could you explain what you mean by that and speak to the differences between the U.S., I guess, in general, and England in terms of how they view the role of I guess, God in government or government in general?
Yeah, I can. I listened to a very popular talk radio station whenever I was over there called Leading Britain's Conversation, and so you learn patterns of what's going on in the culture just by listening, not simply to the presenters, but to the people who would call into the show.
Hmm.
And I realized over time is that whenever there was some sort of a problem in a community, in the nation, the first idea was, hey, we need to get a government program to address this, to fix this. I mean, that was the first
Interesting.
instinctive decision that was made by most of the callers and most of the presenters. And then I recall a conversation I had with an ethics professor years ago when I was working on my MDiv, and he talked to me a little bit about the difference between Europe and the United States. And I'd never heard this concept. the difference between the negative rights that you point out as rights of non-interference, where the people look to the government and say, hey, stay out of my business. Those are
Yeah.
the rights of, I have the right of freedom of assembly. I have the right of freedom of religion, freedom of speech, these sorts of things. Whereas in Europe, there's more of a value on positive rights where people look at the government and say, you got to give me this free health care or free whatever. And so it's a different starting point. I found, again, when the problem came up, the thinking was we need the government to address this. Whereas I think more in America, yeah, you're getting a drift in that direction, but there's still quite a few people that don't necessarily have that as a starting point who think we can handle this on a community level, or the church can handle this, or a parachurch organization or some other organization is better fitted to handle this situation.
Yeah, it's a great answer. My gosh, that explains a lot of. Not only that they kind of explain us. England kind of is explaining kind of the fight that we see in our country. Certainly for the wealthy, and people kind of turning against the wealthy, and wanting to give that to the less fortunate or the poor or the people who have less. And of course, that never works out. It just you always have the rich, always have the poor, and then it's just the middle class who suffer all too often. But that's great. No, I appreciate it. That explains a lot between God and government. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's number two, and I want to then end up here and end our conversation, at least for today, asking to I want to speak to social issues, Keith. You mentioned that there are some significant differences, which I think most of us sense, at least, that there's mainly applies to the south of England, which I found was interesting in terms of social issues, which there is a much greater reserve and reluctance to interact with strangers, which I found fascinating compared to the U.S. But I'd like to ask if you could explain to the audience some of the more significant differences regarding social issues, and more specifically, maybe the whole issue of tolerance or sexuality, or how they view wealth and money or morality. What are the main areas? What are the main social issues that you see? And with that, can you explain the differences and maybe the significance to the Christian who's trying to, raise up a family and make good for themselves?
Yeah, when it comes to that, I could certainly answer in terms of differences on kind of the ethics on social issues, differences of opinion on that. But one of the things that was very striking for me, that was relevant for me as a pastor there day to day, is that in the south of England, there's much more reserve. There's much more reluctance to meeting strangers, okay, in social situations. And so I remember I used to go to a Starbucks pretty much every day, and so I got to know the people who worked there really well. So I was trying to explain it to a young man and saying to him, and I was turning it into an evangelistic opportunity, really. He was not a Christian, but he was open to me. And so I was telling him, Tom, this is one of the things I loved about Jesus. I love about Jesus, I should say, is that if he wanted to talk to somebody, he would talk to them. He would not let any visible, invisible barriers get in the way of him talking and engaging with someone. And so I pointed to some women sitting by the window, and I said, here in the south of England, I said, I can't go over and talk to them. They might as well be an ocean away,
Huh.
because there is this reluctance to talk to strangers. I said, unless you're a bridge and you can come over and introduce me to them, there's no way that I can meet these ladies or those men having that business cup of coffee over there. And I said, but Jesus didn't let that get in the way. And I said, Tom, I try to emulate him. I go and I talk to people anyway, and sometimes that's well received, sometimes it's not. But that had huge implications for evangelism. Because think about it. How am I going to share Christ with people if there's no way for me, at least
Oh,
in a
sure.
socially acceptable way, to engage strangers? But this is what I found. The English are unfailingly polite, so I gamed the system against them. So I would go up and talk to people, and they would be like, "Oh, this is a stupid American. He doesn't know any better. So let's talk to him. Let's answer his questions." And because I was relaxed, because I didn't act like I committed some sort of a faux pas, they calmed down, and we were able
Interesting.
to have a meaningful, substantive conversation. Now, look, this isn't true when you go to Wales over in the west, or you go to the north of England or to Scotland. There's a much greater openness to talking to strangers. But I read a book on the history of England, and it's almost like you have two different countries. The north and the south have a huge divide, and one of those striking differences is willingness to engage, talk with strangers. I was in the
Interesting.
London area, and so it was more difficult.
Before we wrap up, what any last words on this whole issue of the differences between any other major or summary last point that you want to make on difference between
Yeah,
the UK and America?
yeah, just a couple things. I do want to hasten to add that the people in the church, though, it's different. It's easier to meet people, and I'll give you an interesting statistic about a major difference between, at least my experience serving in my last church in America before I moved there, as opposed to the three that I served in the UK, is that I'm not joking when I say this. In the first month of having moved to the UK and started serving these churches, I was invited into more people's homes in 1 month than I had in 7 years in America. I'm
Wow.
not kidding. It's just there's more when you are part of the church. There's more of this. Hey, come into my home. Let me serve you a meal. Let's have a cup of tea or whatever. Whereas my experience, even today, serving a church in America, most of the time people will meet you out for
Yes.
lunch,
Yes.
out for coffee, but
Yes.
not invite you into their homes. So there. I don't want you to think that there's a lack of warmth. There is warmth, but it's through the church that I experienced it as well as immigrants.
That's great. No, I appreciate that. Boy, you definitely understand that. Well, I mean, it's firsthand. That's not out of a textbook. That's right out of pages of a well-educated man who has lived on both sides of the pond and served as pastor on both sides of the pond. And I appreciate that. I do definitely, Keith, want to have you back. My word, especially on the issue that you talked about just at the end there, which is hospitality. As you know, I'm 100% Italian. I'm born in America, but my ethnicity is 100% Italian. My mom and dad are both Sicilian. My dad grew up there as a young man, and my mom's parents and grandparents are all from Sicily. And it's interesting because we grow up with hospitality, and hospitality is
Yeah.
someone knocks on the door, you welcome them in, you don't turn them away, and you have people in your home. Same experience I had when I moved to Charlotte. It was a big shocker. People would rather pay to take you out for dinner, which I'm like, that's money. We come and break bread in my house. I cook you something. It's from the heart. It's American culture, a little bit. I think the new American culture, I should say, probably
Yeah.
more recent than that. But let's cover that in a separate episode. I want to
Okay.
dive into that. But hey, Keith, how can people follow you? How can they find you?
Well, I have a YouTube channel, and it's spelled just like right there, Keith Lowder, Lowder. And I'm a pastor at 12 Mile Creek Church, and so we have a Facebook page where I'm posting different things like that. So those are a good starting point. Thanks for having me on the show. I really
No,
appreciate it, brother.
yeah, you got it. We'll put links to that below as well, and we'll definitely have Keith back. Keith and I have been good friends for over 25 years now. Well, God willing, perhaps we'll make another 25 before the Lord calls. Certainly, me home. Little bit older than you, not much. So but I'm en route. So hey, listen, I would appreciate Keith. Thanks for coming. We'd love to have you back. Definitely, will do that. Anybody has any subjects you want Keith to address, just put them down below in the comments, and we can look at that. Maybe consider making that an episode. But appreciate you guys tuning in as well. Want to encourage you to check out my community at StephenGarofalo.com. You sign up, no cost for that, to join my community, and check out Equipped Academy. That's not equipped, but equipped with an ed. Equipped lowderacademy.com. Sign up there for some courses. God's blessings to you. Listen, you know there's differences in this world, but we all started from Adam and Eve. That's the bottom line. So in the love of Jesus Christ, from Pastor Keith here and Steve, that's myself, God's blessings to you. This is your Reserve of Truth for today.